There are a few more theories that you might hear commonly referred to as expanded crisis theory. Some of the terms might feel very, very strange, but they're all very helpful in us understanding what are the appropriate measures to take in responding to a crisis. For example, there is a psychoanalytic theory, which basically presupposes that a lot of people's internal crisis they experience, a lot of the trauma that they've experienced is based on something that's happened in their childhood. And so that existential theory that we looked at previously, the psychoanalytic theory basically says that is coming from a previous childhood experience. And then so as a youth worker, we understand that we have points of reference, namely to psychologists and psychiatrists, to offer a treatment or response that is appropriate and reflective of their qualification and reflective of our qualification. Systems theory is not really an approach, but is more of an understanding about what strengths and weaknesses are there in a client's natural resources. So what we mean by that is that you might be working with a client that is homeless, and then so a client rocks up in your doorstep not at your doorstep, but at your workplace at 4:59 and says, "I've got nowhere to sleep tonight." Systems theory says, all right, let's plot out what are the natural resources that client has. Let's look at their immediate family, their mum, dad, brother, sister. What is the relationship like there? And the client might come back and go, oh, it might be an easy fix, and they go, oh, mum and dad don't live together, and mum just kicked me out. And the answer is, okay, do you have a good relationship with your dad? Is that a healthy environment for you to be in? And they might go, yeah, it is. That's a great environment. You ring the school to double check, call the mum and say, is it okay if your client spends the day with dad? Dad says that's fine. Or it might be more difficult, and then you need to go to the extended family, or you need to go to the network of their peers. And so it's basically looking at that. What are the natural systems that they've got in their life that could offer support? Adaptational theory. That basically says that some people really, really struggle to adapt, and it might be that your client is living in a house where the boyfriend is now living with your mum, and that your client finds that difficult to deal with. It might be that the client got moved to a new classroom or a new school or a new country, or was exposed to a new experience, or was exposed to an experience that they've had previously, which was quite traumatic for them. So that's really about bringing in skills in adapting, skills in learning, skills in being able to move through different environments without having these feelings of anxiety and angst. Interpersonal theory. That's basically an understanding of when a client has a low self-esteem, or a high self-esteem that is based on what other people think of them. And then so a client is constantly basing their self-worth, their self-value on what other people say around them. So when that goes up and down, the client ebbs and flows based on what people say about them. And remember that we talked about the difference between an issue and a crisis, and that all of us have personal issues, and all of us have think good or bad about ourselves depending on what someone says. Someone might say you look great today, someone might say you look bad, or someone might say that what you did for that person was nice, and someone else might say, oh, you just did that so that everyone would think that you're great. And those things affect us. And the difference between when it turns into a crisis is when that client has an insurmountable amount of anxiety or angst as regard to that situation. We also look at ecosystem theory. That's a relatively new theory. It's got 3 parts to it. The first part is the electronic media impact. And so when we're looking at the environment, we're saying what in our environment is impacted by electronic media. And so we look at things like add our 15-minute updates on what's happening in North Korea, school shootings in America, drug developments in other countries, the child sex trafficking in Indonesia. All of these things that we find out about a minute after they happen is all available with a click of a button. And so the impact that media plays can add to our own personal crises if we're constantly bombarded by these images and don't have coping mechanisms. The second aspect of the ecosystem theory is the systematic interdependency. And then so that's when we're looking at drugs, alcohol, oil spills, sexuality, movies. We're looking at themes or issues that are addressed globally that move throughout the world. And then so we mean that in the sense that what happens in America affects what happens in the UK, and what happens in the UK affects what happens in New Zealand, and what happens in New Zealand somewhat affects what happens in Australia. And so we're looking at what crises happen around the world that actually impact different environments. They impact my environment in my own personal house, and our local government, and our local community. That leads on to the last one, which is a macro system approach. And so we're looking at crises where unfortunately institutions and organisations have done a really, really poor job of oppressing people or causing them harm. And we look at the Royal Commission that's on at the moment in terms of sexual abuse in a variety of different service providers. That requires an organisational approach in our response. And then so we can't necessarily work on one-on-one with that client. So let's say we've got a client, let's pick something old-fashioned. Your client goes to school and the teacher hits the student when they do something wrong. And the student comes to you, you're the youth worker, and then you teach them what it means to be able to adapt to a teacher that hits you. Now that's not going to be a healthy process for that client to go to, and it's actually going to bring about more crises and more poor coping mechanisms. They're going to have a crisis within their existential understanding, and so it's going to be that's actually requires an approach where you go to the local school and you say, we need to talk about the way that you discipline your students and what is your discipline policy. So we're looking at things like that. So all of these different approaches you'll probably come across at some point in time, and it's very, very important that we understand where they place.